But first, when the PM and his climate crusader Chris Bowen went to the Hunter Valley last week, they wanted the focus to be on the government's billion-dollar handout for manufacturing solar panels here in Australia, possibly on the side of the decommissioned Liddell coal-fired power station. Now, the idea that a one-off taxpayer handout, even as generous as that, would somehow change the economics of manufacturing in Australia, that this government's subservience to the unions and their emissions obsessions have done so much to damage, well, that's deeply implausible and runs counter to repeated experience, particularly given the Prime Minister had just dropped trade action against cheap Chinese imports of wind turbines, which are about to come flooding back in. So this Hunter Valley announcement didn't generate the scepticism it deserved. But the visits now hit the headlines well and truly, not because of the $1 billion in potential waste, but because of the actual waste. $100,000 plus for two politicians to take two VIP jets in and out of Canberra to the same event. Two separate planes, two separate crews, two separate entourages for the one government and the one government announcement. Now, it is nuts, especially with the added hypocrisy of all the emissions involved for an announcement about reducing emissions.
Considering they're going to a solar announcement that's all about reducing emissions, I certainly hope they were at least offsetting the emissions of those two jets with companies, you know, like Greenfleet and other places like that, where you can offset the emissions of your travel. So I certainly hope, and I call on the Minister for Climate Change to do that.
Now, I am not saying the Prime Minister should not have gone to Liddell to make this announcement once it became government policy. But the idea that the PM and his minister needed two planes because one 14-seater Falcon jet couldn't handle the travelling party, well, that's absurd. And as for blaming the Air Force for the decision to use two jets, well, that's just dishonest.
The Prime Minister has a large jet available to him. That would normally be what we take. The runway at Scone wasn't strong enough to take the large jet, so the Air Force recommended and took the decision for two small jets.
It was impossible for you to go together in the one plane.
Even the small jets weren't fully laden because of the weight restrictions on the. Even if we had, with the Prime Minister's security detail and other people involved, going from, as you'd imagine, the Prime Ministerial visit, two cabinet ministers, we limited the number of staff, and even then, that was the Air Force advice, the most efficient way of getting us there.
That's utter BS. And I know how these trips work. VIP jets, Air Force jets, they are booked through the Defence Minister's office. The RAAF squadron, they actually have a dedicated staffer in the Minister's office to handle bookings on behalf of every minister in the government. And they're in contact with the Prime Minister's office every day, throughout the day, sometimes hourly. Now, normally, if a minister is to be involved in a prime ministerial announcement, either the minister makes his or her own way there on a commercial carrier like Qantas, or they get on board the PM's plane. Now, to get his own plane, the Climate Change Minister must have separately applied to the Defence Minister's office to take a VIP, and the Prime Minister's office, which, as I said, is always informed about the use of these Air Force jets ministers put a bid in for, well, they must have approved it. Indeed, speaking to people today, they confirmed to me that the rules I worked under in the Prime Minister's office are exactly the same as the current government, and that Mr Albanese takes a very close and personal interest in who uses these planes. So trying to blame a political decision to take two aircraft on the Air Force is low, and it's wrong. It's another sign that the Prime Minister's office is asleep at the wheel on these issues, that ultimately can only really be managed by them. Just like the follow-up on that immigration detainee disaster, this is basic politics 101, and the Albanese government is failing at it. Now, I get they couldn't take the big jet the PM usually flies because the runway was too short and can't carry the load at Scone, hence the need for the smaller jet. Nothing wrong there. The madness is that no one said, cut back the entourage. Take just the staff you must take. So the PM's security detail, one or two essential media staff, a policy expert in case there were tricky questions the PM might have had on the detail before he was briefed ahead of the announcement. Now, all of that, plus Bowen and the Prime Minister, could easily have kept it well under 14 people. It's not as if they were travelling with luggage. I mean, this was a day trip. They could have all gone on one jet. And it didn't happen, did it? So the taxpayer ends up being hit with a $100,000 bill for 2 planes to Scone, and the PM wants you to believe that he cares about cost of living pain and lowering emissions. Well, wrong on both fronts. Either the PM really can't stand being in the same space as the Climate Change Minister, who's doing so much damage to his government, or this is a government that's become so indulgent, so entitled, that ministers use VIP jets like taxis and have retinues like Arab princes. I mean, let's not forget Richard Marles spent nearly $3 million on Air Force jets himself last year. Either way, it's a terrible look. In politics, it's not the big things that bring you down, but the small things that ordinary people can understand. Voters often glaze over things when governments spend billions and billions, but when politicians waste money on indulgent frolics, they get that, especially with a Prime Minister who looks like he's there for the trappings of office rather than the hard work that should go with it.